Hello, everybody. Welcome back to season 2 of the Life in Business podcast, also known as Seriously, with a big question mark at the end. My name is Jake. Once again, I am joined by our fabulous co host, Jolie. And we are here to continue a little bit with the questions from the first episode, as there were some extras we wanted to answer.
This is the first episode, the first season.
The first episode of season 2.
Oh, okay. Oh, gotcha.
Because it's still episode 1.
Yep.
Right. Instead of being confusing and calling it 13, it's like, oh, we'll just call it season 2, episode 1.
Okay, I gotcha.
Figures it'll be easier, but you know,
You're the expert.
maybe we get yelled at. I don't know. I just assumed that's how you would do it. So we got 2 more questions to cover.
Okay.
And then if we have more time, I have some extra micro questions that we picked out. But additionally, we might talk about entering retirement, the process of that on your end,
yeah.
and if you want to share anything about that.
It's wonderful, by the way.
It's wonderful. So yeah, let's go ahead and start with, I'll just go through the last 2 questions we had. We had question 2 and question 4 remaining.
Okay.
So question 2 was, what mistake taught you the most, and how did it change the way you work?
So, this is kind of a sad story to tell, but I've used it as the one thing. I mean, if you have a regret, and for me it was lessons learned. I was very young. I must have been 24, 20. I was probably 25. And I was in a people leadership position. And there was a lot going on in the business. Well, informal people leadership position. I want to be careful how I say that. There was a lot of stuff going on in the business, and very long story short, there was a lot of administrative work, just tasky work, like auditing books, looking at accounts and things like that. And it was my responsibility, but I let somebody else do it. Well, they did it for me once, and it was really nice. And then they just kept offering to do it. And then I just kind of shifted that responsibility over to them. And they were doing some things that they shouldn't have been doing. They were taking money out of accounts.
I was about to say, I can see where the story's going.
And she was a girl much older than me, almost like a motherly figure in some ways. And she was out because her kids were sick, chickenpox, which nobody gets chickenpox anymore. But back then, kids got chickenpox. And I thought, okay, I need to get back on these. Shouldn't take me much time because she has them in such great shape. And I had even stopped kind of looking over her work after a few months. And that's when I discovered it. And at the end of the day, I was accountable for that, even though I didn't do it. And I think that at the time I didn't really feel like I was, because I'm like, well, I didn't do it. And it took me a while to really understand that I was the problem, because I let her take on something that she was not responsible for, that she, at her level, I mean, there's lots of things that I didn't do right. Now, I didn't take the money, but obviously I was responsible for it.
Yeah.
And so I had considered her kind of a friend too, which was another lesson learned. When you're a people leader, you're not friends with the people below you. You're friendly, but you can't have personal friendships. It doesn't work that way. You can be, very empathetic and very supportive, but that whole concept of, oh, we're just all one big family, not really, because ultimately you're accountable. And for me, that was probably the biggest lesson learned. And I learned it so well that the negative side of that is I have a really hard time trusting other people. I'm constantly auditing work because once I realized I was responsible, it was like a blow to me. You are responsible. And so I think that that's probably my biggest lesson learned. I hope nobody else learns it that way, because I felt betrayed. I felt like I'd been thrown under the bus. I felt like everybody was out to get me. And I was probably too young to have that experience. If I'd been a little bit older, maybe I would have gotten it a little bit quicker. But it's also a lesson that I've used for other people, because when you catch somebody, sometimes something's happening in their organization, they'll say, well, it wasn't me, it was so and so. Yeah, but you're accountable, you're responsible for knowing what's going on. And that's a burden of leadership that I think a lot of us don't understand. So I would say that was my biggest lesson learned.
Yeah, I was gonna mention back in season one we had that episode of how to be a leader,
Mm-hmm.
and something we did talk about, which resonates with your story here, is the burden of
Yes.
leadership.
Yes.
And I think, especially in the modern, at least in like my generation, we have a lot of people who enter the workforce with the mindset of go up the ranks, get to the
Mm-hmm.
highest position you can. And there is a level of, and I saw, I think, a video of it the other day, there is a level of not everyone can be the highest position,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's so many people I know, and I'm sure I've said this before, but on my business side, we have a person who's leading who's never led before, and the burden of leading. Just now,
Mm-hmm.
we are now, I think, 6 months into their project that they lead, and they are just catching on to how hard it is
Mm-hmm.
in situations to like be a leader in those situations where it's like you need to know what's going on with your team, you need to know what's
Mm-hmm.
happening. And I do think, roundabout way of saying, yeah, I totally think a lot of people don't understand that angle of leadership and why it's important, because all you hear are these stories of like managers at stores who just yell at people or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what you think, like, oh, if I was in their position. It's like, but you got to also understand, if you're in their position and someone under you makes a mistake or whatever, that reflects on you as much as
Ultimately,
it
you're
does
responsible
them,
for it. Yeah.
or as much as it does them, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something that there's so many people who will not be able to be in a position like that.
I don't think we don't all have the disposition. And I have a really good story not that long ago, not where I retired from them, but the company before. I had my CEO call me and ask me about a retirement scheme that we'd put together for somebody. And we had rolled it out. I mean, I think I'd been at the company maybe 2 or 3 months, and my boss had kind of worked it up with our comp person and handed it off to me. And their pension and their equity, it was very complicated. And I didn't, even when I left after almost 4 years, there were still things about all that I didn't completely understand, because it had been a conglomerate of things over time. And so there was a lot of what I call stacking stuff. This changed that. And you had to really know a lot about the different plans and how they came together and what superseded what. And I didn't, even when I left, but I was with one of my presidents and he was getting ready to retire. And we kind of put this scheme together to keep him a couple more years. And it seemed logical to me when it was explained to me, and I sold it to him, and he trusted me. We already had a good relationship and it felt right. And so when my CEO calls me probably 2 years later and says, "Hey, talk to me about this scheme you guys put together. Who put that together? Whose was that?" And I said to him, "Well, ultimately I'm responsible because I sold it." And he goes, "Okay, that's not my question. Did you design it?" And I said, "No, I didn't design it." And he said, "Who designed it?" And I told him, these two people's names. And I said, "But I sold it. I thought I understood it. I sold it. And if, let's say his name was Bob, Bob now is getting shafted because of that scheme. That's on me. I own that." And he goes, "You always, you always take the responsibility. And I appreciate that. And it does you credit. But you have to realize sometimes things are not your fault. You don't know." He goes, this basically hurts him drastically. I'm going to undo it. He goes, "But it took like 3 weeks for me to even understand that." He said, "I had to have our general counsel explain it to me." He goes, "So I'm not faulting you, but when I ask you who made it, I'm not looking for you to take the fall. It's not
Mm-hmm.
your fault." And I think that is, and now that I'm retired, that was a problem that I had, or a weakness that I had, is because I learned that lesson so well. It's like, well, I'm responsible. I
Yeah, it,
sold
it
it.
almost gave you reverse
Yeah.
issues,
And so I just take it. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes my team would appreciate that, because ultimately I'm the one that takes it. I never said, "Well, so and so did." I'm like, "It fell on my watch. It's my responsibility. I will fix it," or "I'm accountable," or whatever it is. But I would like to think other people wouldn't. For me, the lesson was so severe, because we're talking about a lot of money. This
Mm-hmm.
person took a lot of money. And that to me is like the ultimate, that's the ultimate bad thing that you do, is steal from your employer.
Yeah,
That's
back
really
back to
bad.
the answer to the
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
So anyway, there we go. That's the answer.
No, I think that's a really good answer, because it really it echoes kind of what this podcast is about. It's the idea of there are things in business that from the outside looking in, you won't fully encapsulate the scale, importance, impact of in positions or of leadership responsibilities and stuff like that. So I think your answer really does paint that, especially from your perspective as a person who self-admittedly is very own what my team does, I
Mm-hmm.
own what I do, you know, and there's just a lot of people who don't do that, both in business but also just in general. And I think that's something that it's a good lesson to have and a good mindset to have. But
Well, and I think another thing I would add into that is if you're working with a leader who it can be a little bit of a control freak, or sometimes there's things that have created that in them.
yes.
And I got I don't want to say accused, but I think I would even say to my team, I know I'm being a control freak, but you learn a couple of those lessons early enough or strongly enough, and you're not going to let it happen again.
Hmm.
And so you tend to close ranks and jap onto something to figure out what the heck's going on here. And I used to always say to my folks, you don't want me in your business because I become a micromanager. And I can stay out of things for a long time, but once you start to see things going off track and you jump in, it's almost impossible for particular personality types to let that go. And
Hmm.
so I don't like it when it happens to me. I do not like to be micromanaged, but I know I tend to do it when I'm like, something's not right here. And then unfortunately, sometimes you have a self-fulfilling prophecy. For me, it was really hard. I just recently had a situation where, well, recently, say 6 months ago, I had a situation where somebody was given a very complicated task, and I knew that they weren't doing it right. And I tried to advise and I tried to coach, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to let this play out. And it failed.
Mm,
And then they called
mm,
me and told me something that I knew because I could see it, and they had just discovered it. And I said, you need to fix it.
hmm.
And they were justifying and justifying. I finally said, stop talking, go fix it.
Hmm.
And this person was able to rally a couple of peers, and they came back and they got it done. And I felt bad because in some ways I felt like I might have crushed her spirit. But when it was all over and you kind of, deconstruct it later and say, what did we learn here? One of the things that I said is, you'll never make that mistake again.
Hmm.
And that's, you've heard me say, I think in prior podcasts, when if somebody's giving you advice or somebody's asking you something, a lot of times it's human nature to discount the question. But I think the most important thing you can do is ask, why are you asking me that?
Hmm.
And so I would say something and she would get defensive and discount what I said. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to let it fail. But if she had stopped and said, why are you asking me that question? I could have said, because I see X, Y, and Z, and this is what's going to happen with X, Y, and Z when you roll the marble.
Well, and I think people are just, and I don't know if this is so much a societal thing, but I just people I know in general, people are just defensive
We all
creatures.
are. I am too.
Everyone,
Yes, I'm very defensive.
especially when you're outside of your wheelhouse, right? If you're in something that you're
Or you're
trying that's
emotional.
new or you're
Mm-hmm.
emotional, I always notice it when people are doing things they don't know super well, but they're super passionate or
Mm-hmm.
interested in, and they always are in a position of like, I want to do the best thing possible, but every
Mm-hmm.
little thing makes you super defensive, and you're like, well, I mean, yada, 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 to the point where it's like, well, like you said, I do think even asking the question back, but also internalizing it of why am I being asked this?
Mm-hmm.
Can I figure out why I'm being asked this or why this person made this comment? Right? Why is
Mm-hmm.
that sticking with me? Is there something I missed? Go back and find out. And but yeah, I definitely think that's a defensive, just human nature
Mm-hmm.
thing, which will be very hard to get out of anyone's
Well,
system.
I think you
But
model away from it, but I don't think how you feel inside ever really
oh, it will
changes.
never change. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's how can you adapt to it, you
Yeah.
know?
And under stress, those bad traits come out in everybody.
No
So,
matter what. Yeah. Okay, well, let's go on to the next question,
okay.
because we've been on that one for a while. The other question we had was question 4, which was our last remaining question of our curated selection, which was when things were uncertain, how did you make the tough decisions? So I think this
Mm.
question was kind of framed around the idea of if you're in a situation of only of not black and white, of only not morally gray, but
Mm-hmm.
situationally gray answers. How do you make that decision? And I guess what experiences do you have making those decisions if you want to share those? But how would you go about analyzing, approaching making a decision like that?
Yeah, it's so interesting that this question came up. I actually was working with a team member at one time around this. I very much like, I called it standard work or an operating system, because one of the hardest things to, I think, get ahead of is knowing what's out of control. And if you're a black belt, we use control charts and stuff like that to say so many times what you're seeing is the symptom, not the root cause. And so for me, I promise I'm answering the question of, what do you do when things are uncertain? But you first have to determine what's uncertain.
Yeah, what's the uncertain value or
Because
property?
sometimes on the surface it seems really complicated, but you can dissect and analyze a lot of things that are standard and non-standard.
Mm-hmm.
So something happened and somebody responded in X way and the response was inappropriate, but you need to understand the sequence of events that led to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do have a mantra that I always used. When you look at it and you say on the surface it's not black and white, you're in the gray, and the higher you go up, the more in the gray time you spend. And so I'm going to speak for a moment as an HR person, I always say, what would a reasonable person do? So when and then this is on the HR side, then I'll talk on the business side, but somebody did X and you look at it and you look at the sequence of events that led them to that, and you say, is that how a reasonable person would have responded or not? I think, unfortunately, as I moved up in my career, one of the things that became more and more part of my day was more egregious type of things. And typically what you could see if you stopped and you looked at, like I said, the sequence of events, you could find patterns of behavior. And in the work environment, and I think in your personal life, you do something small that's a hand smack and you get away with it. And then it just starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so from an HR perspective, when you finally catch somebody who's done something, this isn't the first time they've done it. They have a history of doing this stuff. And I think I've talked about this before on the podcast, so I won't go into a lot of detail there. But I do think that you've got to understand the circumstances from which something is coming. And then more on the business side, I think you have to play out in your head, and sometimes you have to do that pretty quickly. You have to play out in your head, what are the scenarios? If I take door 1, where is that going to lead? If I take door 2, if I take door 3, if I take door 4. And so there's been a lot of times, whether it's, behavior, whether it's when to hire, when do you pull the string on, doing a layoff. There's a lot of things that you can't know, but you can build enough information to say, here's where that marble's going to roll.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've mentioned before that, in the Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTJ. So I'm certainly somebody who's constantly looking at things, monitoring things, thinking about where things are going. It's just a process I can't control in my head. And you think about a marble. For example, I'm married to a person who is not a systemic thinker like me. That doesn't mean he's not smarter than me. He may well be. Certainly he has better mechanical aptitude than ever I've had, and I think I'm pretty darn good. But he doesn't necessarily, he's in the moment. So I say, oh, I want to do X. And he's breaking down all the little tasks that have to happen. And I'm thinking, well, after I do X, then I'm going to do Y, then I'm going to do Z. And he's still into well, to do X, you've got to break it down into all these simpler pieces. And I think those things complement each other well. So I think if you're like me, you're thinking about, well, where is this going to roll? What are the consequences? What's the worst case scenario that can happen? And then if you're like my husband, his issue is, well, how do you actually get that done? And I think you've got to play to your strengths. That answer's not going to be the same for everybody. But the one best piece of advice on when things are uncertain, never put something in place that you cannot undo.
Yes, for sure.
And so I learned that pretty early on at a big, huge conglomerate company. I was at a huge multinational, and we had an incredible CHRO. I have never said his name here, but I've mentioned him before. He was such a strong mentor for me. And he used to say that we'd put a policy or a process or some type of a program in place, and he'd always say, "What's your exit strategy?" And I think that's the best advice I could give to anybody is don't ever do anything that you can't undo. Don't make it permanent. Make sure you've got enough wiggle room if it's a policy, if it's a process, if it's a relationship that you've entered into. Make sure that there's an opportunity that you say, this is when I can exit, and this is what happens when I exit it.
Well, and I was thinking of this early on when you were going into your answer. It's almost like don't assume, and this is an issue not beyond HR, but in a lot of situations, don't answer or solve things as if they exist in a vacuum,
That's right.
because every single thing has led some like
Yep.
it's corny and not entirely true, but the butterfly effect is
Mm-hmm.
essentially a real thing to some extent, maybe not in the way the butterfly effect is choreographed,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the idea that there is a reason everything has happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
There has been a path. You can go back down the trail and find how did this start? Where was the first
Mm-hmm.
domino tipped? And sometimes it's even situations where if it gets really complicated, multiple different paths have led to this, but like two paths colliding has made a
Mm-hmm.
third, and that's something you have to keep in mind as you go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that you gotta rationally go in the direction of understanding it from that whole perspective. But you were talking about like mechanical bit by bit versus large scale, and I would, and maybe you would disagree, I think what you're describing of going back, right, and figuring out event to event, event to event, to figure out how did we get to whatever situation we're in now, is that mechanical piece by piece. You're just looking back on it, you're not planning forward for it. And I think that's, to an extent, is easier for some people because it's easier to analyze a situation than predict a situation, right? Or predict a future. It's easier to look back and be like, I understand the steps that got us here. I can go through those steps
Mm-hmm.
backward, right? And I think more people are in the position to be able to analyze both big term and small term looking back than going forward to
Well,
some extent, but I think
mm,
it's good to think in both as
I
much as you can.
I think you're right, and that's what I was trying to say. You're going to have a natural disposition for one. You got to do both, but I also think that one of my husband might kill me, but one of the things that we argue about the most is sometimes we get into the specifics, and sometimes the specifics don't matter. I worried that sounded like Pacific. The specifics don't matter. Sometimes you've got to go between the trees in the forest and the trees in the forest,
Mm-hmm.
and that isn't something that aperture change back and forth isn't something that comes naturally. And I don't think it comes to anybody quickly.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful country song out there. And it talks about, like, who's it by? I think it's by, oh, I can't remember what his name is, but he talks about lessons in life are learned, and, none of them are easy. And one of the things that he talks about is most of them just come with age.
Mm-hmm.
And they do. And when you get to be older like me, you begin to see that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't always identify where you had that learning. But I do think that, I promise I'm tying this back together. I do think that part of it is learning to just accept in the moment what you don't know
Yes.
and not making assumptions, which is where I thought you were going. It was really hard for me, I have to tell you, because I spent a lot of my time doing investigations early and even later in my career, or reviewing other people's investigations and say, well, is that a fact? Do you know that? Or are you just filling in the
Are you
gaps?
surmising
And I've had
information?
many
Yeah.
people on my team that will tell me something and I'll say, wait a minute. Who told you that? Oh, no, I'm taking the stories and that's what I think they're saying. Don't try to think what they're saying.
No. Take
You
what
need
they
to
say
take
word for
exactly
word.
what they've said because you fill in the blanks from your own particular perspective. That may not be fact.
This is, what's a very similar thing to that exact framing is it's the same with like journalism clickbait articles, right? A
Yes.
lot of I don't want to say the specific article because it's inappropriate and not important to this podcast, but there was a recent large CEO of a pretty notable company who had a statement that every journalist and their wives or their husbands and everyone around them basically took as a completely separate statement. Because the situation, like you said, is the statement itself that they said was surmised to be something like they took it to the illogical
Mm-hmm.
extent that that is clearly not what they're saying here. You are taking the statement
Mm-hmm.
in bad faith and then throwing your own meaning onto it.
Mm-hmm.
You're almost kind of not that that's the exact same, but the same idea of you don't want to do that, especially among peers and things
Assume
like that.
nothing.
Assume nothing at all. You want to understand at the level they are trying to
Yes.
communicate it to you, you
And
know?
a good whether you're I don't want to say investigator, but a good knowledge seeker will say, what does that mean to you?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody says something, you say, well, what did that mean to you? Or how did you interpret that? Or because we're the sum of all of our experiences. And sometimes, people's experiences are vastly different. I know I've shared on here before the concept of a shoe. What is a shoe? And that happens in every incident that plays out. I might think that a tree falling in the forest is a terrible thing because it took out 10 other trees.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somebody who understands about forestry might say, well, that was necessary because they were all diseased.
It's like forest fires,
Yes,
you know.
it's
It's
they're bad, but
people
yet they
saying, yeah,
have to
they're bad,
happen.
but they have to
Yeah.
happen for X
Yeah.
reason.
And it's even the concept like you have a pet, your pet is suffering horribly. You love your pet. Is it the humane thing to put them to sleep or not?
Mm-hmm.
That's a question that we all have a different answer to.
Yeah, I think, and this was the uncertainty question, but I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a lot of every single almost question to some extent can be an uncertain answer or
Mm-hmm.
conclusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, it's like I'm sure you've seen it where there's the two guys pointing at the logs on the ground drawing,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
one says there are three logs. No, there are four logs because it does truly, despite how politically satire that thing was,
Mm-hmm.
it's very true that it really depends on how were you looking at the situation because that would radically
Mm-hmm.
change a lot of your perception and input and thought process and
Mm-hmm.
how you got there and yada yada yada
And the
yada.
thing that's interesting is, like, I think you said most of our viewers are a little bit younger, of course, than me, so I'm the old fart.
Millennials are our
Yeah, fair.
highest viewer count.
But it's so interesting that, at different points of your life, if you're reflective, I love to meditate and I've meditated for decades, but at different points in your life, you'll stop and you'll look back and you'll see choices you could have made and didn't. And sometimes you wonder, was it even a choice? Because in the moment, it didn't feel like a choice. You had to
Mm-hmm.
have a job or your job was moving you, but there's always a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And it those choices led to the path that you're on, but any other path, you'd be a different person.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Don't know.
You know, yeah, it's one quote I always get told in my more creative spheres that everyone just talks about is, I believe the Frost poem, "The Path Untraveled"
Oh
or
yes.
whatever,
Uh-huh.
and it's like I heard a really or I read a very interesting poem that kind of questioned that poem by saying, well, there's a reason that path is untraveled. If you travel that path, does it just lead back to the first one?
Uh,
And it's like, that's interesting because think of like I that reminded me of like those times where like at OSU when they walked and they made natural trails and they built
mm-hmm.
things there. It's like, okay, well then that is a question to ask, you know, because is it always a clear A or B path, or is it, well, everyone naturally walks down one because they don't even realize it's a choice,
Mm.
like you say. But
Well, I think there's a I can't even remember what this is from, so please don't get me in trouble for if I don't think this is a direct quote, but I remember something somewhere in life. I think it was a poem that talked about, how much of your lives do you choose and how much has been decided for you.
mhm,
And I think we make a lot of choices
mhm,
and yet maybe we don't. Or we think, oh, I didn't have a choice. My parents made me go to college. We had a choice.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the consequences of the other choice might not have been what you wanted to live with.
Well, and
But
there's stuff like right now, every single person listening to this podcast could make the choice to just leave and walk somewhere.
mhm,
Why would you? But there's the story. This is a very interesting story. There was a 20-year-old, I think Englishman or Irishman, but they were visiting Europe with his group of friends in their 20s, and they were drunk or whatever. And one of them told him as a joke, as people that age would do, no, you can't walk from X to Z. And there was like two completely different countries across the world. And that guy made the choice that day to say, no, you can. He has been walking for 32 years
mm,
on that train. And again, people are like, well, that's ridiculous. Obviously, I'm being extreme in my example, but that everything is some sort of choice, whether you discern it to be a choice
mhm,
or not. But let's move on. I
mm,
do have one question that I was sent on the short list, or on the second short list, I suppose,
okay.
the long list, that I thought was interesting because it's a question that I don't know how you're going to answer, and I think that's going to be intriguing. But we had a couple people apparently ask. There's people who've listened to the podcast who are actually interested into going into HR.
Okay.
And some of them wanted insight. And now I don't know the age demographics or anything. We don't collect information, so we don't know. But let's assume these are, I don't know, college, maybe early career,
Okay.
right? And they want to go into HR full career or whatever.
Mhm,
And some of them were asking, or somebody, the question I had specifically was asking, for people looking or prospecting to go into HR,
mhm.
what is a good piece of advice for them in any major regard that you think is essential to being in the HR space long term? Something they need to either, a question they will come back to repeatedly and have to
Mhm.
adapt their answer, or a question that they need to ask and understand before they feel like what they could be in HR is a good HR representative or something of that nature, if you understand what I mean.
Right. So here is the one thing that I know I've created a lot of stress in people that have worked on my teams before. There are different paths in HR.
Mm-hmm.
So I was always a generalist, meaning although I had extensive experience leading compensation, including executive compensation. I had done OD&L. I had done talent because my master's is I'm an IO psychologist by education. But if you really want to, I think, be the best HR person, you need to decide what space do you want to play in. Do you want to be a data and analytics person? That's where I started. I started learning data and analytics, and I do think it's foundational. So that's the best piece of advice I can give you. Learn how to capture data and interpret data to help yourself and other people make data driven decisions. I think that's really important. And there's all kinds of stuff now in AI that can help. In my day, and I still tended to fall back to this because it had been successful, it was download the data, use Excel to manipulate the data, and figure out what the data was telling you. Now you can use lots of AI tools. I think that's very important because that helps the HR function understand what's effective and what's not effective.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going into HR, kind of understand what the branches of HR
Mm-hmm.
are, what the branches of HR are. Boy, that doesn't sound right. But I know one of the companies I was at, they portrayed every career as a stream, not a ladder. So instead of going up the ladder or steps, it's a stream, and you kind of meander down this stream that goes from left to right, and it moves up, but sometimes it moves horizontal, and sometimes that stream kind of doubles back on itself and then moves. And I think the best advice I can give for somebody going into HR is experience all of the possibilities. If you think I want to be an HR leader someday, I want to be responsible for a business, you need to know compensation. You need to know labor law. You need to know benefits. You need to know data and analytics. You need to know talent. You need to know staffing. And I can go on and on. You need to know a little bit about everything. And there are a bigger company will give you that exposure versus a small company. And none of that time is time wasted. So that's the advice I would give, is explore and figure out what you want. Now you may find, I want to be a comp person. I want to do salary analysis. I want to put together structures. I'm very data driven, and that's kind of where I want to spend my space. Somebody else might say, ooh, I want to be in the information system. I like the programs that run HR, whether it's collecting data, storing data, analyzing data, making payroll payments. Payroll's part of HR too. And that might be the space that you want to be in. But don't limit yourself by thinking it's X. I do think it is foundational to get generalist experience as soon as you have analytics experience. And that's dealing with people. That's what everybody thinks about when they think of HR, is you go in and you hold hands and you sing kumbaya, or you report on people that are being bad or whatever. That's the generalist side. And that's the side that says, I am administering the policies of the company and ensuring the culture. And I think that's important because it teaches you how to interact with individuals. It teaches you how to do problem analysis, conflict resolution, and you learn to use the little terms that everybody makes fun of HR for, like, well, I think these two positions are a lot closer than what it feels like right now. So let's talk about what we all want on the same page, and then let's get into the things that maybe we're disagreeing about. Figuring out, how do you coach? How do you mentor? How do you discipline? Being that person who can listen and say, ding, 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 there's something bigger here, or this is just somebody having a bad day. That's something that you don't learn in any program. You don't come out of college with any kind of a degree and know how to be a good generalist. To me, it's the hardest part of HR. And that's why I said my team would get frustrated, because I'd say specialists, whether they're in staffing or talent or OD&L or comp, they do not overrule generalists, because generalists have to figure out how does all of this come together. And in most contemporary models, the generalists interact with the people, and all of those specialty functions are behind the curtain. And so they never interact with the people. So the generalist has to figure out what the person wants, go to the person behind the curtain, get what they need, interpret it, and then give it back to the person. Because the people behind the curtain typically are a little bit more functionalized and tend to be a little bit more limited in their thought processes. They're only looking at it in this concept, where a generalist has to say, well, how does it play in the world? It's kind of like the difference between the people who make the medicine and the doctor that says, well, how will this medicine impact this person based on all the other issues that they've got?
Yeah.
And so that would be my advice to somebody going into HR. I've said it is a tough job. My mentor used to always say it is a full contact sport, and it is a full contact sport. You never really know where your day is going to take you. It can be incredibly rewarding. The good thing is that you don't typically have 4 or 5 days that are really bad in a row, but you also don't have 4 or 5 days that are really good in a row. I remember telling somebody, go into HR, and I always tell people early in their career, usually when they're coming in through a development program or something, be prepared to be disliked by everybody. Because the people dislike you when they don't get what they want. And then when they do like you, it lasts for 5 seconds, and then they dislike you again.
Yep.
The business dislikes you because, oh, you don't care about the business. You only care about that person. Or you don't understand how this fits into the bigger scenario. And you do. And that's what you're trying to manage. But it is a bit like being a man on an island. And so you got to be kind of tough skinned. If you enjoy disciplining people, if you enjoy terminating people, do not go into HR, because you should carry that burden heavy, and you should realize, and I've said this to a couple of people on my team many times across, right? I've said this to a lot of times, we say that, it is the most severe decision that you can make in employment is to terminate somebody.
Oh, for
so it
sure.
has to be reserved as something really egregious. Or a pattern of behavior that they just can't seem to get. The whole purpose of discipline is to change behavior. So it's like your child, they've done something, and you give them a timeout, or if you spank them, whatever it is, it wasn't to hurt them. It was to teach them not to do that. Don't do that anymore. And so I think that HR can be incredibly rewarding. It's very stressful. It's very hard on you as an individual, but it can be a really good ride.
It's
I
a,
wouldn't pick it again if I were going back. I would have chosen my original path, was to be an OD&L practitioner, really an IO psychologist. That's what I wanted to do, and I made different choices. I had a great run in HR, but I don't know that I had the temperament for it.
well, and I was thinking when you were describing it, it's almost like HR is the willing sacrificial lamb, where it's like the lamb has to be sacrificed one way or another,
You're
come to
always going to
terms
be
with
on
it,
the
you know?
you're always going to be on some level of losing side. It's
Yeah.
how do you manage the loss. Now, and other HR professionals might say that's not true, but
You have to
you
be
have to have very,
prepared
very
for
thick
it.
skin because you can't win, and no good deed goes unpunished. And a lot of times, when you're at a higher position, you assert yourself. People will say things like, "Well, what does HR know?" Just stay with the people. That's all you're supposed to be responsible for, and you really are trying to influence and change. And I saw a really interesting billboard. I was up north of Atlanta, I don't know, a week or so ago, and I saw a really interesting billboard. It was an advertisement for some company that it basically said HR can't sell a culture that doesn't exist. And everybody looks to us and says, well, you're responsible for the culture. No, we can't create a culture without the right leaders and people. They have to be showing that culture every single day. And I had a CEO not that long ago that just said, well, just put something on the wall and then everybody will think, well, great, because that'll be our culture. Your culture isn't something that you write and put on the wall. The culture is how people interact with each other.
It's almost like this could be a really out of there comparison. It's almost like HR is Anubis in the afterlife weighing the heart against the feather on the balance
Ooh,
scale.
maybe.
But that's the level you should approach each decision of the temperament and the scale and the importance of every decision almost. At least by the way you're describing
And
it to me.
it's a very interesting life. So, but it is good. I mean, both of my kids, I have two children, have said they would never go into HR because they probably heard me say a million times at home, "Don't go into HR, don't go into HR." But you know what? You can really have an incredible career in HR if you've got the right temperament. I've seen a lot of people in HR, and not that long ago we were interviewing somebody for a VP position, and I knew where he had worked before, and I was asked to go and kind of get some intel on him behind the scenes. So I called up some people, and I heard consistently from the four different people that I called that had worked with him is he shouldn't have been in HR. He just didn't belong in HR. And one person in particular, she had been his like senior leader, and she said, I sat him down and said, I don't think you have the right temperament to be in HR. And his issue was that he really liked the power over people.
Mm.
And you have a lot of power in HR over people, but again, you have to have the right temperament to wield that power because it shouldn't be a power that you pull out often. It should be something that you say, yeah, it's there in the background, but I'm wanting you to make the choices. I'm wanting you to do the right thing. And he came and he worked less than a year, and it was, I mean, I bet from the second week I said don't hire him. He was hired anyway. Within a month, I was hearing things like he was saying behind the scenes, well, we're not going to do that. And it's like, he's on the group that's responsible for implementing it. And yet he's telling another group, we're not going to do it because he's wanting to get in with them. It was a train wreck. He lasted less than a year. And when he left, people were like, he probably was the single most damaging force that we've seen in a while. And that's because we hired somebody who wasn't the right fit. So, okay. What else did we have? Sorry.
Well, we're actually already kind of at the end of the episode.
Okay. So let's
So
cut it.
we covered the remaining questions. Do you have any final retirement insight as we go into season 2? I guess this will be kind of the denouement of part 2 of questions, but we have a lot of interesting topics I feel like coming up this season to go into. But is there anything you're excited, looking forward to season 2 to talk about?
I think I feel a little freer going into season 2 because I'm not working.
You're not bad.
I'm
What's
not.
the what did you say? We had a conversation. I'm out of the chains or
Oh,
whatever it
yes.
was.
Yes. When I retired, I posted on Facebook because somebody sent it to me knowing that it was my last day. She sent me a thing, and it's Genie from Aladdin where
Yeah,
the
Jeannie.
where the
The
bands on his
bands are
wrists
off.
fall off and he's looking at it all confused. And so that's really how it does feel. And my husband and I have made a lot of great financial decisions for me to retire. I'm 55. I don't know if I've ever mentioned that before. So I'm relatively young to retire. Had some health issues, and that's really what pushed me to
We spoke
retire
about it
now.
last episode
Yep.
a little bit, yeah.
But at the end of the day, it feels incredible. My husband and I have a ton of stuff that we're going to do in the next couple of years as long as I'm feeling really good and I'm mobile and I'm able to get around, because I will lose that, I'm sure, eventually, based on some of the things I've been struggling with. But yeah, we're just going to enjoy life. We're going to travel, and I think I've agreed to do a little bit of consulting on the side on a few things, from people that I've known. I've started up a little YouTube channel, kind of going through
A
my
little
day and showing
like a
different
vlog,
things. Yeah,
yeah.
a vlog, that's what it is. And I did that because it was suggested to me that it might be a fun way to have some creative um,
Side
license.
hobby, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not doing it because I want to make money on it or I want to have a big following. I'm just doing it because it does make it a little bit
It
fun.
fills the days,
And
you
to
know?
some extent, the number one reason I always recommend it is because it will kind of log this journey for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm all about doing different things. I mean, I have journals that I kept from before my kids were born. And I log particular events in their lives and stuff like that. And so I think it'll be fun to look back in 10 or 15 years at these different things that we did. We have a couple of big international trips coming up, a lot of day trips and trips down to Disney because we're Disney freaks, and so that's what we're going to be doing for as long as we can. We're going to be traveling and enjoying this particular phase of life.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening to episode 2 of season 2. Trust we have 10 great episodes coming up for the rest of the season, and we will see you all next week for the first of them. Have a fantastic rest of your day, everyone. Goodbye.